Leah, who did a PhD at the University of Melbourne and then got a job at ACU in Melbourne.
Not quite in
So as you've seen, you know, from the brief blurb, a lot of Leah's work is about prejudice and discrimination, and particularly the use of implicit measures to evaluate these things. What was very interesting talking to you was that Leah not only does research on this, but actually puts her knowledge into practice, both in relation to ethical leadership and in relation to the unions. And I think you might be saying a little more about that as well. And as well as some general coverage today, I think you're also going to focus a bit on implicit measures of self-concept and mindfulness, which are very dear to the hearts of people of IPPE. So, thank you, Leah.
I will attempt that. I will say that my coverage of self-concept will be better than my review and hopeful questions to you about mindfulness. I'm trying to make that leap. My area of research interest is implicit measures specifically, and they come from mostly the US and mostly prejudice research, so that's where the heartland is for us, which is great. But I do wear many hats here at ACU, and I want to take, before I get completely distracted by the research side of things, take a moment to say to you two important things. First of all, I am your ACU, one of two ACU National Councillors for the National Tertiary Education Union. That is, I am a representative on the union for all staff, professional, research and academic staff here at ACU. So if you have any questions about union membership or union anything, please feel free to get in touch. You actually have someone here in Sydney who's actually at North Sydney, not so far away as I am, obviously down in Melbourne, but I'm equally happy to answer questions. And I'm going to be doing a lot more answering questions because we're about to enter EB negotiations again in April. So I really wanted to say that to you first. The second thing is, you might see my name attached to things occasionally that you get back through the ethics committee. That happens. If you have any questions about that, or if I can be of any service, standard protocols or anything else, please let me know, because obviously we actually have a really good ethics committee. Anyone who's come from other universities hopefully is experiencing a really positive contrast being here. Certainly it was a blessing when I came across from other universities, but the plan is to be very collaborative in that approach too. So obviously many hats here, and this is probably my favourite one, but just in case. So I'm going to talk today mostly about implicit measures because, well, I was saying when I arrived that I've been doing this stuff since I started my PhD a few years ago. In fact, Facebook helpfully reminded me that today, 6 years ago, I submitted my PhD. So it's a pretty remarkable thing to reflect on, and 6 years seems very long and very short. So I've done a lot of work since then in terms of applying those measures, and do so both in terms of research context and in the business community. And we've started to move from that business community into employee well-being, it seems. And I'll talk about that a little bit later question. But first we'll focus on some of the things about those implicit measures. So the first talk I gave on this topic was actually called Don't Know and Won't Tell, the Value of Implicit Measures. And it turns out we were all wrong. That's a really good place to start. In terms of what implicit measures are, they're about that don't know. So for example, in 1977, so this is going back a bit, we found out that there were things that you just can't get at with introspection. So there are a number of processes particularly, but even outcomes that we can't access just by thinking about it. And Nisbet and Wilson wrote a fantastic seminal paper on this topic, outlining 3 particular classes of things we can't access through introspection. And these are things like the stimuli that we're unaware of. So anything that involves subliminal priming, we hope people are unaware of, otherwise it's not subliminal. That happens too. But subliminal priming is going to be one of those kind of conditions that we just can't access. We don't know what's going on there. We're also unaware of our responses in some cases. So for example, that we're having a response to something in particular. And best examples of this is the insufficient justification paradigm. There are lots of versions of this, but maybe the most compelling and the one that's mentioned in this original paper is where participants engage in a learning paradigm where they receive shocks. Always fun. It was obviously, I think it's the late 60s they were doing this. And what they found was when people were offered a justification, i.e. we've just completed a round of shocks for learning, we know that the shocks improve learning, will you consent to doing a second round? People say, yeah, okay, but they're more willing and will learn more, in fact it affects their performance, if you don't offer them a justification. So for example, if you say, you've just completed a round of shocks for learning, would you like to complete another one? And participants say, oh, why would I do that? And they say, well, we don't know what the relationship between shocks and learning is, but will you have a go anyway? They actually perform better under that condition. They're unaware that it affects their response. And when asked why their performance is better, they can't tell you. So this is a demonstration that people can be unaware of their response under certain situations. And of course, we have a large number of things in psychology where the stimulus and response, the relationship between those two things are completely unavailable to introspection. So the Donald paradigm, which is Wire and Schwarz from 1979, I think it is, what happens is they provide people with a prime, word completions, and they're about hostile words, or in fact about stereotypes. African American stereotypes are used a lot in this paradigm now. And then they read a story of Donald. Donald is a largely unlikable character who turns people away at the door. He yells at a mechanic for not having his car ready. He refuses to pay for something in the shop because it's not what he wanted. He's still your friend and you take him out to lunch. And then you ask people to form an impression of Donald. Now, the people who read about the African American stereotype rate Donald as significantly more hostile, consistent with the African American stereotype, both immediately, 12 hours and 24 hours later, so it sticks. So it's the relationship between a stimulus, which is obviously that priming, and the response that you're having. So people can't always access what's going on. And anyone who has tried something like mindful walking would be really aware of this. If you have to focus on the walking, anybody can walk, most of us can walk most of the time, with ease and without any kind of concern, but as soon as you start to focus on that process, it becomes difficult. You waver, you wobble, even balance can become difficult. So introspection can have two effects. First, it can have no illuminating effect, and secondly, it can actually interfere with things. So, there are things that we don't know, and in fact, implicit constructs fall directly in this basket. Implicit constructs I'll define in a second, but essentially, by definition, they're things that are inaccessible for introspection, and this is hopefully what implicit measures measure. Initially, when we encountered implicit measures, so in the late 90s, early 2000s, people thought that unpopular, undesirable, and uncommon topics could also be assessed by implicit measures. Particularly, we would be able to find the real or the accurate version of something. No, it's not a lie detector. Unfortunately, this is not the case. We actually think implicit constructs are specifically and clearly represented elsewhere to the explicit one. So this is not going to help us necessarily clarify what people actually think, explicitly and consciously think. But it is going to help us understand what fills in the gaps between what they're willing to say and what they're not. Speaking of that thesis, when we think about where implicit constructs are meant to be remembered, even new ones, so novel implicit constructs become part of our representation, and we can see from a model of memory by Schwarz in 2004 that there is a basis for thinking about where these are going to fit. And knowledge representation, being things that we're explicitly able to articulate, belongs separate to other types of mental representation, stored information that we can use but may not be able to say. And this is where we think particularly implicit associations or implicit constructs, things like attitudes, prejudice and self-esteem, self-stereotypes, general stereotypes, and even implicit affect is going to sit. So it's going to sit right in the middle of that unexpressible content. It also goes part way to providing further evidence that explicit and implicit constructs are going to be separate. And times have changed since we started. So this happened a couple of weeks ago, and I must say it's really nice to see that an area of research is having an actual impact in the world. That hasn't happened to me a lot in my relatively brief career yet, but it's certainly starting to happen now. So implicit biases, we're talking about prejudice, particularly racism, but also sexism. And in the last couple of weeks, it's become a real talked about thing beyond those researchers who want to talk about it. And this is why. A single measure, and I like to think it's probably not just the measure but the actual paper itself, seems to have changed the nature of this research. So a review of all the papers citing implicit measures and the IAT specifically, prior to 1997, the paper was published in 1998, was 7. Single digit 7. In 1998, there was a single further paper, which was that IAT paper. I've excluded stuff on implicit memory because there is a lot of work on implicit memory, which is very specific to its area, though it contributes and informs implicit social psychology and implicit social cognition. But I've taken it out because it's a different literature. And implicit theories, obviously the idea of essentialism and incrementalism is taken out as well because that's a completely different literature. So what we've been left with here is just those papers looking at implicit constructs measured by implicit measures, priming, implicit association tests and related measures. And as we can see, over the 18-ish years, we find that we've gone from a mere 8 papers to more than 2,600 papers in that time. So the IAT has really given us a great deal, both in terms of inspiring interest and also in terms of the breadth of these constructs. So what is the IAT? How many people have used or how many people have completed an IAT? How many people have used an IAT in research? Okay. So just for the people who haven't, it's a really interesting thing to try it. It's massively tricky to explain. It's really simple to do, which is really uncomfortable. So I put up here what it is. It's essentially you're going to do 2 blocks, and I'm going to get you to do it. I put one into the PowerPoint. So I'd like everyone to put 2 hands on these or on the table or whatever it is. And it's not going to be race. I don't want to be controversial. It's going to be about bugs. What I want you to do though is, you'll see each of these as a trial. You'll have to judge a single stimuli presented in the middle of the screen as belonging to either the category or attribute on the left by tapping the left hand, or the category or attribute on the right by tapping the right hand. And then in the middle it'll swap, but you'll put it on one end. So initially we're going to do fruit and put it on the left, and bugs and bad on the right. It's going to be much harder for them, but that's okay. Alright. I've timed them. You wouldn't usually be timed because your response would provoke the next trial, but it's quite slow. Ready? Alright, so that would be the comedy I got. Alright, we're going to swap these. What you need to bear in mind now is that the fruit and the bugs remain in place. So left hand for fruit, right hand for bugs. But now you're going to put fruit and bad together by tapping the left hand for either stimuli and bugs and good on the right by tapping for either of those stimuli. Alright. That's harder, right? Yeah, okay, so...
But it's harder not just because it came second.
It is harder because it came second, but not just because it came second. Yes, arguably it's because the first block was a congruent block. The ideas were related in memory in the same way that if I said bread, you would probably say butter, although I've done that in class and not all the students do. Or doctor and nurse, dog and cat, that kind of association. Whereas the second block doesn't have that association. Okay, so there are lots of achievements from using the IAT, and I will start there. I'm going to say some less positive things about the IAT in a second, so I will get there. But there are lots of reviews which point out that the IAT has achieved a lot. It's achieved a lot across a large number of areas, and it's demonstrated some really important things that implicit measures need to. Just like self-report measures, the accuracy of which is uncertain at times, implicit measures can be valid. Doesn't mean they're inherently valid. They're not always right, but they can be. They certainly measure something personal. The first explanation was that, in fact, the information that has gone in isn't chosen. For implicit constructs, we see lots of people who are egalitarian still demonstrate lots of implicit prejudice and so on. So how could that be? The first explanation offered was that it was a cultural phenomenon. But we see individual variation that suggests that it's personal, and we can change it like it's a personal representation as well. So we know it's personal and not cultural. And we can see other forms of validity too. We can see intercorrelations with related measures. We can see prediction of behaviour. And we know that particularly the IAT has high reliability. And in fact, in terms of behaviour, it predicts, like all measures, less well, as well, and better than other things. So we've got it pretty much covered, right? It's just like any other measure. There is a but. There are some pros. It gives you a palpable experience of an introspectively unavailable concept. I mean, I'm sure that each of you has a view on bugs and fruit, which you can experience, and it's probably aligned very strongly with your implicit construct. But for some topics, this is not the case. And that task, the simple difficulty of having to pair things that don't seem to want to go together, can allow you to experience those cognitions or those representations in a way that you can't otherwise. This can be a real drawback. You can expose participants in a research study to something that they don't want to know about themselves, and we certainly get that feedback from time to time. As a result, it's received considerable attention. People respond to this, participants respond to us in ways that we don't want to do this task, or in fact, if you are standing there while they're doing this task, they quite frequently object to being asked to pair things like black faces and negative words. And it's also received a great deal of research attention. It's widely used by people, in fact, very widely used in thousands of publications. So that's pretty good. And as a result, we know that the effects tend to be quite stable, it has high reliability, and it correlates with some other criterion variables, including other measures and behaviours. The methodology is pretty easy to deal with. You can download it, you can upload it from various places, you can access it online. You can do it pencil and paper style, which requires someone to be there and time people, because it's how many you can complete in that time. And the effects are huge. You know how priming effects can be tiny, like milliseconds, 2-digit, sometimes single-digit milliseconds. IAT effects tend to be very large, which means our samples don't have to be very large, which is great. However, there are some drawbacks, and this is where this begins. It is controversial, so the interpretation of the simple pairing of words meaning good things with some groups and bad things with other groups as racism or sexism or anti-gay prejudice or any number of other prejudices is still very controversial. You want to tell somebody that they're racist, that's hard enough. You want to tell them they're implicitly racist and they couldn't control it, that's a whole different game. So that's a big issue. There's also some debate still around the idea of things that are implicit versus implicitly measured. Not everybody agrees that there are two types of constructs. And theory is catching up. It's probably now more 60-40. For a long time it was about 30 undecided. So we're making progress, but there is still some debate in the literature, and whether it is truly assessed implicitly comes up again as an issue of methodology. The method, the IAT method, is tricky though. It's very easy to run, but it's quite hard to design, and this is because there are things like order effect. The fact that bugs and bad and fruit and good was so easy made bugs and good and fruit and bad harder. So there is a significant order effect. There's also a handedness effect. If you had to, people like to pair the most frequent target with their dominant hand and so on. We find that there are practice effects, and there's questions about the implicitness of the IAT, which is a trick because the IAT has the implicit association task. And that's because the IAT doesn't usually have a window. That means people can take as long as they want to respond to each of those pairings. So if you're doing research and they're not supervised, this can be a problem for you. You'll either have to edit out those trials that are really long, or you have to raise the question. Now, one of the interesting things in research using the IAT is we've moved away from reporting actual reaction times to the point where we now use a scoring method which gives us what they call the IAT-D score. The IAT-D score is a measure of effect size, and it hides the fact that a lot of the trials that we're seeing coming out of IAT research are longer than a second. That's what you had there. So you can see that it's on the border of uncontrollable, but for some people it's not. And as a result, this test can be faked, which is pretty tricky for an implicit test you're meant to have no control over. And in fact, De Hoover and colleagues in 2009 stated that one of the criteria for a test to be considered implicit is for it to be out of people's control. The response itself couldn't be controlled. So this raises some really good questions about poor versions of the IAT. Not all versions, but some poor versions. The scoring requires some choices. The IAT-D score has even got some variations. And probably the worst thing about the IAT, the most difficult to deal with from a research design perspective, is you get a relative score. So you don't get a score for how bad bugs are, in the test I just gave you, or how good fruit is. You get a score for how bad bugs are and good fruit is, which you would compare to how good bugs are and how bad fruit is. It's a relative index. You never get a single score for a single target, which can be a real problem for us because there are very few things we're interested in where that relative association is going to be super meaningful. And if you think about it, I'm heading towards talking about the implicit self. And what is the equivalent of self? Because it surely isn't other as a general category. And this is a problem for the IAT because you're going to have self versus other, unspecified other, possibly multiple others. So that's going to be a problem for the IAT, which is why the SC IAT, or the single category or single target IAT, came along with its own problems. It's also the reason that the go-no-go association task came along. So the NAT is a very old cognitive paradigm which is about responding and not responding. In doing so, you get a single association for a single target and attribute. You don't have to worry about handedness because you can respond to all of the targets using one hand or both hands if you like. And it takes out some of the alternative accounts. So for example, the equivalent of the NAT congruent and incongruent blocks is much more similar and requires far less of this idea of a task switching approach than does the congruent versus incongruent blocks of an IAT. And that's going to get a bit specific, but there are lots of alternative accounts of the IAT effects which cause problems with interpretation of those measures. So let's try a NAT. Just to see the difference, the NAT is an easier task to explain just because you have one target category, bugs in this case, one target attribute, and you respond to stimuli belonging to either of these with any hand you like. And if you see anything else, you just don't respond. The one thing is, it's fast. Okay, this is a real plus because implicitness, we like to say, happens for most people as a function of their age. But we're pretty sure it happens around 750 milliseconds. But certainly, if you're getting a response before the 600 millisecond chances are people are not in control of whether they're able to do it or not. So, these will be at 600. This will be fast. You will make errors, and we like to tell people not to lose hope, just to keep going. There are not too many trials, and it'll take, I think it takes 15 seconds. So, you ready? Bugs or bad respond to anything else? No, don't respond. Okay, so that would be a congruent block. People typically achieve a about 50% of trials in the warm-up period, but over 80 trials. A block is 80 trials long, which luckily is less than a minute, right? They tend to achieve 75 to 80% accuracy, more for congruent blocks than for not congruent blocks. And here's the not congruent version. So bugs and good you're responding to, anything else, so pictures of fruit or bad words, don't respond. And at the end of that, it's fast. At the end of that, you would get a measure of accuracy. So we no longer have that ugly thing to deal with of reaction times either. So let's deal with the goodness and the badness of each of those. The IAT requires 5 blocks to test a comparative attitude. That is something good, something bad, versus something bad, something good. The NAT requires 2 blocks. So initially it's already shorter. We don't provide any training because the task doesn't require as much thinking about. We always provide a practice set of trials, which is usually 12. So about 6-8 seconds. Scoring, we use signal detection theory paradigm to score a go-no-go task because that's what it's based on. All we have to do is detect a signal. You either get it right, you have a hit. False alarm is when you've responded and it was the wrong kind of trial. Miss when you've missed it when the target was present. And obviously a correct rejection when you haven't responded and the target wasn't present. So you get a D prime out of that, which I don't exactly know why this is the case, but they typically come out normally distributed, which is just one of the greatest things. Particularly if you've been working with the reaction times, which are never, ever normally distributed. So that's a real plus. You can also have a look at the discriminability of the 2 stimuli, so that you can do that by calculating a bias score using that parameter from signal detection here again. You do have their reaction time so you can see if there's a difference. This allows us to detect if we've got a really bad stimuli in our set. So for example, you can see that people aren't very accurate and they respond to it much more differently. The profile is different. But we don't use it because there is obviously an accuracy-speed trade-off with each of these measures, so we tend to pick the accuracy measure which we've favoured. The IAT gives you a comparative association, but the NAT gives you a single score for each target category attribute association. That in and of itself makes it very easy. You can say, for any target, self and good, you have a number. Self and bad, you have a number. You can compare them if you want, but it's not in relation to anything else. The distractor stimuli give you context. That's very useful because you can actually put it in a grounded context, but you don't need to try and extract that number itself. There are fewer alternative accounts than there are for the IAT because of the nature of those 2 tasks being more equivalent, the congruent versus the incongruent, and the NAT cannot be faked. This will be resubmitted this year, now that I've finally got enough males in my sample, but we've tried it with all kinds of training and it cannot be faked. It doesn't matter how much experience you have. So this is a really good test in terms of implicit measures, and it has many advantages even though it's been less used than the IAT.
What is the correlation between these?
Because the reaction time versus the accuracy, there are lower correlations, but a multi-track, multi-method paper looks at them and it looks like it's about 0.4 to 0.6. So they look like they're related issues, but not perfectly. And in fact, the problem across all of these measures, including priming and something called the name-letter effect, is that they all correlate somewhere between 0.16 and about 0.5. So in terms of implicit measures, we think it's probably because of method-related variance, but it's a good question.
So can you repeat that, those latter correlations?
Sorry?
Can you repeat those latter correlations?
Okay, so when we're looking at, I've got a test of it with self in a second, and I'll put up the range.
Sure.
But yes, they're small, sadly small, 0.15 to 0.5, 0.6, depending on what they are. Okay, so the implicit self. As I said, this literature really comes out of prejudice, but one of the very first papers offered by Greenwald, who is obviously the author of the IAT, was to propose that implicit constructs it comes from a social literature, so they're in fact part of the social knowledge, and obviously a core part of social knowledge is the self. And they proposed this model, which is that the self sits in the heart of all socially represented knowledge. It is in fact primary, and for most of us it is typically positive. The only other primary nodes proposed in this model are positive and negative, and they've put up, for the purpose of this model, gender as well. They say it's a primary social category. And self is going to sit in the heart of that and be attached through these associations to all of the other things that are relevant. It's a bit of an old model, so I'm not going to go through it in great depth, but I'm going to say that there are mechanisms proposed that resolve any inconsistency. So for the self to be strongly associated with positive and yet to be associated with something like forgetful or distrusting or something that is negative, there are ways to resolve those associations. But the system is proposed on the basis of consistency theory, so the idea is that it's trying to maintain itself in a very stable and consistent way. And they demonstrate, using this model and a bunch of regressions, that where you have things like strong associations with your gender identity, that you will add strong associations between positive, so implicit self-esteem, that there is likely to be a strong association between your gender and the evaluation of that gender as well. So for example, you will feel positively about your gender, you will have high self-esteem, and you'll be strongly associated with your gender, which accounts for one of the most tricky findings that emerged early on, which was that men tended to like men more and women tended to like women more. That was the interpretation of the finding, having found that when they evaluated each of those genders initially, there was this difference. Obviously, in-group biases work, and that makes sense of that. But why is that the case, given that they were expecting a majority view, in the same way that, unfortunately, we tend to find that majority racial groups like themselves more, and so do the minority racial groups. So they were expecting to see something more like that, because the idea again was at that stage that it was very much about social knowledge and social experiences, but this is a theory that comes out of that and does speak to this issue. It also provides the basis for modern views of what the implicit self is, and gave rise to a huge number of papers, in fact more than 150 papers on the implicit self. The implicit self was measured in many, many ways. The IAT was one of them, but as you can see they also used supraliminal priming, which basically means that they could see the primes, subliminal priming, they couldn't see the primes, a strict colour naming task, implicit self-evaluation survey, and these two preference tests. So the initial preference test is also often referred to as the name-letter test, or the name-letter effect, and it's the preference people demonstrate for their own initials. So you ask them to do this somewhat insane-looking task where they have to judge how attractive stimuli are, and the stimuli are letters that just appear on a screen. People judge on a scale of 1 to 5 or 1 to 7 how attractive these stimuli are. You think people would see through it, but seemingly they don't. And when you ask them afterwards what they think the purpose was, they don't. It's really hard to score to, because you actually have to get the person's name and then go through all the letters and find their initials and calculate a mean attractiveness score for their initials versus all other letters, so it can't be scored neatly. Birthday preference test is exactly the same, except it's for the numerals in your birth date, essentially. So there are these two. Implicit egotism is what they call this set of tests, and these are the results. So explicit measures correlated significantly and positively, which we would expect. People who have self-reported positive global self-esteem tend to also say that they like themselves, they value themselves, and so on. But the implicit measures were largely uncorrelated. They were not significantly correlated except for the two preference measures which were correlated. So the degree to which you liked your own initials was correlated significantly with the degree to which you also liked the numerals in your birthday. The correlations between implicit and explicit personality measures were essentially non-significant. There are a couple of exceptions to that, and no explanation of why these are not everything else. And the explicit measures correlated with the criterion variables, which included ambiguous statements and feedback seeking, which they thought only people with positive self-esteem would seek feedback because they're basically seeking some kind of verification of their status. And pretty much nothing else did. The IAT correlated at low and essentially non-significant but stable levels with everything. So this was a bit of a concern, and this paper is called Stalking the Perfect Measure of Self-Esteem. So obviously there was some concern about it. And a decade later, a meta-analysis was conducted with 137 studies, sort of. So they're not very clear about how many studies actually ended up in the final analysis, but okay. It's very exciting. It's sort of in the air, but anyway. So about 137 studies were examined, and they found negligible correlations between implicit measures, and the implicit measures in question were the name letter effect, or the initial preference test, depending on who you want to go with, and the IAT. They found limited relationships between those implicit measures and the explicit measures, and very few studies had used any kind of behaviour. So in terms of a meta-analysis, that was a problem. And they concluded this: the research literature has not provided strong or consistent support for the validity of either IAT or hampered test measures, and we conclude both of these tests are impoverished measures of self-esteem that are better understood as either generalised implicit affect or implicit egotism. No definitions of those offered. Now, that's worth bearing in mind, because if you're going to say it's something else, maybe we really need to know what the something else is. And it dismisses a lot of work in this area that has found that those impoverished associations actually are meaningful. Granted, in this particular field, that is a question. But before I dismiss implicit self issues altogether, here's a more optimistic view. So Back and colleagues did a study, not a meta-analysis sadly, but a study, where they gave a model which looks as complex and as small as that. But let me tell you, what they're talking about is on the left-hand side you have situational cues that provoke you to think about who you are as a person. And that activation occurs both at a conscious and a non-conscious or implicit level. As a result, both pieces of information then become part of the process, leading to your behaviour in a very specific kind of way. They measured they measured personality, the 5-factor model of personality, so neuroticism, extroversion, openness, agreeableness, and conscientiousness, explicitly and implicitly, so using a questionnaire and using associations. And they found that neuroticism and extroversion measured things that were highly correlated, explicitly and implicitly. So neuroticism with neuroticism and extroversion with extroversion, not the other way, right? So that's good. They also found that implicit measures of neuroticism and extroversion predicted behaviour and did so beyond the explicit measures. So when the question is asked and a model is provided, rather than a random kind of let's just measure some stuff and see if they fit together, you get a very different result. And I offer these two conclusions from these two papers. So the first one, measuring self-esteem, comes to the conclusion that the shortcomings of the measures rest on dubious assumptions that self-esteem can be reduced to simple self-related associations. This would be the same thing as personality, except the association they're talking about is not a valuation, it's an attribute. In contrast, Back and colleagues presented a behavioural process model that clearly specified why emphasis was mine and how, also my emphasis. The self-concept of personality should prove relevant when it comes to predicting what people actually do, and it does. Which raises some very important things from this literature. The lessons learned from this literature are, it's not just the measures, the goodness of the measures that counts. Reliability and validity obviously are important, but not all research questions are equal. The idea of, are these things related, is not perhaps as good as I have a theory why these things would be related. Let's see if they are now. So, these are the kinds of questions that need to guide this literature, and implicit personality is much newer than implicit self-esteem. So, in terms of this research, we've learned that having a reason to believe constructs, explicit and implicit, or implicit behaviour should be related, should be a guiding factor in terms of what you're measuring. When and how they should be related also must be considered, because they're not necessarily always going to be the same kind of thing. We see under certain circumstances that people can be encouraged to say things that they believe are only moderately true, but the implicit is not controllable in the same way, in which case you would expect these things to be uncorrelated. And finally, and this is a good question if you're thinking about using an IAT, does a relative index make sense? Sometimes it does. When you're measuring prejudice and you want to see a relative index between various kinds of social categories, it can be useful to have that relative index. But for most occasions, particularly when we're talking about the self, there isn't an equivalent category. And let's just demonstrate the value of that now one more time. So, Peters and Greenwald in 2010 proposed 2 ways that explicit and implicit self should be related. And they propose, in fact, a model called the associative propositional evaluation model, which tells us how all implicit and explicit constructs feed into a process where they're renewed and influenced by each other and consequently predict behaviour. So the APE model provides a framework for considering the interconnected implicit and explicit self-constructs through self-construal, or the experience of self. They propose that in daily life we encounter a data-driven or a bottom-up self-construal. That is, if you were to say to yourself, who am I? You would go back to the information that you have about yourself, your autobiographical memory, and your implicit evaluations or implicit concept, which will be sitting there in the background guiding any kind of statement that you would make. And this would lead to, from a measurement perspective, that autobiographical memories would be influencing the implicit construct, or in fact influencing and influenced by, and both of these things together would predict your explicit self. And that's what they see. In fact, implicit memories completely account for the relationship between autobiographical memory and explicit self in this situation. However, this doesn't allow, that only supports stability. Essentially that would be checking out who you were from your memory and using that to go forward. But we know that people change. And we know that people can change very suddenly and in a very motivated way, right? So there's a literature on these self-changes, or a version of these self-changes called motivated self-perception. You can tell people that a particular attribute is really good, that they really want it. It's associated with success and money and fame, whatever you want. You could say health. It depends what they want. And motivated self-perception allows people to, on the spot, following a paragraph of less than 100 words, change who they report themselves to be. And you think, well, they're lying. That's what I thought initially. But they're not. They not only change their self-ratings, they generate autobiographical memories that support this, and implicit associations that do as well. In this case, you can demonstrate that by telling people that, for example, introversion is associated with success, they will report higher levels of introversion, and they will demonstrate a self-concept, an implicit self-concept that is also demonstrates a high level of implicit introversion. So in fact, they do change their self-perception, their self-construal, in seconds. It's amazing to watch, and this is exactly what this finding is. So you can actually demonstrate that the implicit self is part of that system of maintaining stability for us most of the time, but it is also capable of great change. So this was a really impressive finding, but it used the IAT. So as a result, they couldn't tell what the difference between implicit introversion and extroversion was. So we went back and did it with the NAT. Paper just submitted. Hopefully people love it. But anyway, we'll see. Where we tested their full model. Essentially what we did is we had a look at the relationship between each of those pieces and the effect of, so this is going to be the hypothesis-driven explicit to implicit change. But we did it with introversion and extroversion, which are not equal. Everybody knows that being an extrovert is an advantage. That's the title of the book, The Extrovert Advantage. You're sociable,